Drinks, food, art, fun. This is Hops and Spirits Kentucky.
Christmas season is officially upon us. The calendar has flipped into December, and we've got another great episode for you this week as we talk with NKD LDY founder Becca Gardner. I'll explain more about that later as part of our Q&A, but first, some news and notes from around the great state of Kentucky. First, we start off with December anniversaries for Kentucky's craft breweries. Mile Wide in Louisville celebrates on December 9th, Goodwood Lexington on December 14th, Rockhouse Brewing in Lexington on December 16th, and then both on December 18th you have Scout and Scholar in Bardstown and Siglusher in Frankfort. Maiden City out of Cynthiana on December 22nd, and last but not least, Versailles Brewing Company on December 29th. And the Brewers Guild also has some limited time offerings that would be perfect gifts for the holiday season. You can find them at KYG Brewers on Instagram. Click the link in their bio to find all the details there. In bourbon news, Bardstown Bourbon Company is opening a new experience in downtown Louisville. It'll be at 730 West Main Street, complete with educational classes, a full-service bar and bottle shop. It is set to start pouring in summer 2023. The bourbon attraction will hone in on the Bardstown-based distillery's modern skill in blending and aging bourbon. Oh my goodness, blending and aging bourbon and cocktail making, so you'll have to keep an eye out for that come summertime. And then back in Lexington, Griffin Gate announced it will be hosting the inaugural Bourbon Con on January 20th and 21st. The weekend will feature 30-plus bourbon and culinary partners who will offer tastings, cooking demonstrations, panelist discussions, and live interactive entertainment. Visit griffingateevents.com for more information. And up next is our Q&A with NKD LDY founder Becca Gardner. The non-alcoholic spirits company is based out of Louisville and is doing some pretty cool things in the non-alc space. Hear how it all came to be next. Enjoy.
Remember to check out Hops and Spirits on social media at Hop Spirits, all one word, on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and Twitter. You can also find Hops and Spirits on YouTube and at hopspirits.com.
Joining us here for our Q&A this week, she's the founder of NKD LDY, and she'll explain exactly what that means here in just a second. Please welcome in Becca Gardner.
Hello.
Well, Becca, thanks for joining us. And for those that, I feel like this time of year, we're going to so many get-togethers, so many different events that we might be having some drinks. And maybe we don't always want them to be as strong. And that's kind of what you're probably going to be talking about. But before that, the Cliff Notes version of a little bit about yourself to not give too much away for the rest of the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born and raised in Kentucky, actually grew up in Henry County. And after that, I moved to New York City, where I spent 12 years. And right before the pandemic, I came back to Louisville. I was working in consulting in New York, and I actually moved back because I wanted to start the company that we'll be talking about today. And so I'm living in Louisville now, and I love to say I feel like it's the happy medium between growing up on 1,000 acres in the middle of nowhere and living in Manhattan. So, but yeah, I'm a non-drinker. I gave up drinking about 5 years ago, but I have always been a pretty avid fan of the hospitality industry and creating, drink and food experiences for people. And so I guess what we'll be talking about today is the company where I really tried to create a little bit more inclusion for folks like myself that kind of hopped off the wagon.
and it's true that many are doing that. And you're one that likes to stay busy because, like you said, you've got, the distilling company that we're going to be talking about that produces a couple different non-alcoholic spirits. I think you're a yoga teacher. You've been a board member on numerous nonprofits and things like that.
Yeah.
I mean, do you ever slow down?
Not really. I have to say though, it's so funny because, moving back to Kentucky was one of the best decisions I ever made for myself. And I think there is just this kind of chaotic energy of the city in New York where you feel like you have to always be doing something or you're going to be falling behind. And so I have to say, I'm very busy with the business, but I really have found a little bit more time to just spend with myself and my fiance, which he appreciates moving back here. So still, really trying to find balance when I can.
I completely understand that. Completely understand. I think many of us are like that. And you mentioned that you were in the hospitality industry and you came back to Kentucky to launch what is now Naked Lady. What led to the creation of that? And for those that don't know, it's spelled or stylized NKD LDY.
Yes, yes. So naked lady without the vowels. Well, so I gave up drinking while I was still working in consulting, and my job really was living in hotels, flying several times a week, taking clients out to dinners. And while the decision for me to stop drinking ended up just being a great decision for myself, I thought it was going to be something temporary, but it ended up just deciding to stay with it. And it was good for so many reasons. The disadvantage was that I quickly felt so alienated from so many of the experience that I had once lived. I've always been a pretty social person. So whether that's going to bars or restaurants or just, doing random things, there's always drinking involved. And so, this went on for about a year, but then I got to the point I was so frustrated that I knew there had to be a better way. And I actually decided I wanted to leave consulting, and I was interviewing for this job in London. And it was my dream job for a lot of reasons, but I was actually more struck by the non-alc space in the UK 3 years ago. And so, I spent almost all of my time in London, and I probably spent a month there total, going to every bar and restaurant I could to see what non-alc options they had. And I just left with this idea that, something like this could also work in the US. And I ended up kind of, putting the points together where I was like, wait, I grew up along the Bourbon Trail. I'm from Kentucky. I'm a lover of spirits. And, maybe this is something where I'm well suited to try, to do something about it. And so it was a couple months before the pandemic, which ended up being great timing, frankly. I left New York, moved back in with my parents in Shelbyville, Kentucky, to start kind of figuring out what it could look like to create a quote unquote authentic non-alcoholic spirits company. So,
Well, and like you said, for those that don't know, Europe is way more, you know, in the world of non-alcoholics. They've been doing that for
totally.
a long time, whether that's beer or spirits, and now the U.S. is kind of catching up. You know, you mentioned that the Naked Lady, how stylized is without the vowels. What does the name signify? Why did you go with that look and everything like
Yeah,
that?
yeah. Well, as you being a connoisseur of spirits, there are many brands, especially in the brown spirits category, that are named after men. So I think, initially I wanted to name this one after a woman, and I hate to say when I couldn't think of a good choice. I wanted it to be something a little bit more generic. And I love the word lady, which is kind of the Southern ubiquitous term for a woman. And then, you know, naked having multiple meanings. So I think naked being stripped down in the sense of the hospitality industry, but I think also naked and just kind of that feeling of like, going into these social situations and not necessarily having that shield or that lubricant. And I think for me, that was something that initially was really uncomfortable, but building this business has really been about trying to create a lot more comfort and even, celebration or even cool factor around that. So kind of elevating that idea of kind of stepping into these spaces undisguised. And so that was really the heart and soul behind Naked Lady.
Well, it's a great name, and you can always say it's just so hard to pick one person to name something after because there are a lot of many females that were integral in the alcohol
It,
space that never got their due.
it totally, totally.
And you picked a whiskey, you got a whiskey, a gin, and a tequila. Why go with those three? Obviously, I know you kind of mentioned being in Kentucky, from Kentucky, the whiskey probably had to be a must, but why the other two?
Yeah, so you're exactly right. And honestly, when I set out to do this, it was first and foremost going to be a whiskey. I didn't imagine that out of the gate I would be developing three products. It was actually through a lot of conversations I had with bartenders and prospective customers where I realized that, even though I'm a Kentucky girl, and when I think of spirits, I immediately think of whiskey and bourbon. That's not where, a lot of people, would go as their first choice. And so I think with our mission really being to make the drinking experience accessible to everyone, we wanted to provide folks with some of those kind of core building blocks of a lot of the most common, cocktails they know and love. And so I think, we started with the gin, the tequila, and the whiskey. And I think, we'd eventually love to have like a rum, and kind of continue to build out those product lines. But these cover our at least kind of basic basis for now.
Well, like you said, most cocktails are probably built off of those three, and if that's kind of where most would go with, and bartenders know a thing or two about the drink world and their customers. Yeah,
Absolutely.
I was curious because you mentioned a lot of times, you guys make real booze minus the alcohol, and there's a
Yeah.
bunch of different ways folks have kind of come at this in terms of creating these non-alcoholic spirits. How does your process work, maybe compared to others?
Yeah. So, I think without having a science background, I kind of came into this with this like stubborn resolution that I wanted to make this as real as possible. Um, and so I think from the outset, I really wanted to find a way to somehow use real spirits as a part of the base for our products. And that was how I learned about the process called vacuum distillation, which is a lot more prevalent in the wine industry. I think people have probably seen these kind of non-alc, de-alc wines where, they actually make a wine and then through vacuum distillation, they remove the ethanol from it. And so, my curiosity was like, would that actually be able to apply to spirits? And the answer is yes. It's a bit more complicated. But, so we use that process as our starting point. And what we realized through that is, you can make incredible flavors in a lab today. The science is so much more sophisticated, but particularly for the whiskey, it's a really tough nut to crack. It is very, very difficult to make an artificial or natural flavor that tastes like what comes out of those barrels. And so, for us, it felt necessary if we were really trying to give our customers the best possible product.
And then while you were going through all this, how much fun or maybe not fun was it as you were trying to figure out to get those flavors that you wanted? Because at the end of the day, you can create something that's non-alcoholic, but like you said, people still want to be able to taste things that they're used to tasting.
Totally. And frankly, like, I think part of the reason that we have the other products is because we wanted to offer additional options. But part of it was also because as we were moving along the process to create the whiskey product, we found that it wasn't quite as complicated to perform this process on the tequilas and the gins. And, so I think it was exciting, but it was frustrating. It was challenging. It was definitely more complicated. I don't know how I had an idea of how complicated it would be, but it took almost a year for us to figure out the science behind these products and hundreds of tests. Because, with vacuum distillation and even just like flavor curation, there are just so many different variables that you can tweak. And so, I actually started working on the process on my own. And when I kind of realized what my own limitations were, I started looking for other people to kind of pull into the conversation and have, met a lot of really great scientists and formulators along the way. But, for many of them, this is a completely new type of project as well. It's a new category. I think a lot of people are excited for the challenge, but it's something that they've not necessarily gone after before. So.
Yeah, there's unfortunately not a lot of blueprints
No,
for what folks are doing.
And there's this part of me that loves that, it's like kind of like the wild, wild west. But then in terms of like figuring out timelines and budgets, it's sometimes pretty complicated because you sometimes frankly just don't know.
And that, but that is kind of the spirits category. Sometimes you just don't know,
You
and
just
time is
don't
never
know.
on your. You're just going with time, and when things finally do taste good, and how close do they resemble their alcoholic counterparts? Because I'm sure that's what a lot of people are always curious about.
Yeah. So I think they are, we've gotten feedback that they are the best in the category. And this is a category that is quickly expanding. And I'm sure the science will continue to improve with time. And there will be competitors that really, do present kind of, some competition for us. But I think, that being said, there are some differences. Like when you will, have a shot of whiskey, for example, it's hard to deny that burn that makes you kind of take pause for a moment. And, because we've removed the ethanol from our products, they just don't have that effect. And we've been able to, extract some different derivatives from peppers and stuff to create a little bit of a heat and a tingle, but, we're also not wanting to overwhelm the drinker with that. And I'll say that, drinking neat, you can definitely tell the difference because they just don't have the alcohol. But when you are making cocktails, they're more or less interchangeable, whether it's a margarita or, an old fashioned, they stand on their own pretty well in that context. So.
Yeah, the whiskey is always the hardest, that burn that everyone's quote unquote loves.
And I think the thing with whiskey, it's interesting because we really have this philosophy of kind of like continuous improvement, and we're already working on ways to improve our products, even though we're happy with V1, but I think the thing with whiskey is, especially here in Kentucky, people want to drink it neat. And we don't run into that same challenge as much with the gin and tequila. People buy those, they expect to put them in cocktails, but I think for folks with our whiskey product, like their first inclination is to be like, can I throw an ice cube in it and sip it after dinner? And I don't think we're quite there yet, but it certainly is a place we'd like to eventually reach.
And I think that's something that folks always need to remember when going into the non-alcoholic spaces, is they're not exactly the same, not meant to do exactly the same thing. And if you go with that approach, you'll probably find some enjoyment there for you. And you've talked about this, whether it's yourself that's become a non-drinker, and there are many like that, or many that like to I don't want to say water down because that's not correct. Cut their alcohol,
Totally.
the ABV down. What have you seen with the rise of this kind of culture where that's more acceptable now?
It's as someone who's like lived and breathed this for the last 3 years, I have to say I've really seen. So when I first started, I have to tell you, it was 1 in 20 people, 1 in 30 people I spoke to that would even just see any potential value in this. I think most people thought it was kind of crazy. It wasn't something that really had staying power. And, it's been interesting because that wasn't even just like on the side of potential customers. It was definitely on the industry side. So, when I would talk to bartenders or potential places that we might want to work with, there was a lot of resistance. They just didn't think that, customers would be purchasing these products. And this is more subjective than just like data driven, but it's been really interesting because I would say in the last 6 months, we have had more organic leads in the hospitality industry than ever before, where we have actually had different bars and restaurants circling back to us, who had initially said that they weren't interested in this type of product. And the reason they're reaching back out is because they have so many customers asking for them. And so I think it's really exciting to see the growth. And I don't think it competes with alcohol. It's really interesting to see how many folks already weren't consuming a ton and maybe weren't drinking a ton. And I think because those are the folks that generally weren't necessarily like out at the bars or ordering at the restaurants, these kind of beverages, you don't realize that. But I think what these bars and restaurants are realizing is like, that's a huge population. It's a growing population. And they're leaving dollars on the table, if they're not accommodating these people and these choices. And so I think for us, we see it as a win-win. And, we always set out to collaborate, not compete, and figure out how to work with the alcohol industry just to kind of expand the options for folks in these types of experiences.
Well, exactly. And sometimes when you go out, one person in your group might not want to drink an alcoholic beverage, and it's nice for them to have that option at an event that might have a lot of bourbon.
And I think the other thing I'll say is that it's been really interesting to see how many different reasons there are that people might not necessarily be drinking. And I think one thing that I've really seen in this kind of like strange post-pandemic era is that, if you're not drinking, the assumption isn't immediately that you're an alcoholic. And, while there's nothing wrong with that, I think that people, fearing being kind of labeled as that, for one reason or another, would be a reason that people might not go out at all, or they might drink because they fear the stigma that might be associated with it. And what we've actually found, which is interesting, is that most of our customers are actually drinkers. Um, and it's like about 50% men, 50% women. And it really is those folks that, for whatever reason, it's like maybe they have a big meeting the next day, or maybe they're training for a race, or, maybe they're trying to lose weight. And it's all of these, just like kind of inconsequential reasons where, people would prefer to still be able to participate in the experience just without the booze. And so I've seen a lot more demand from that customer group in the last year, as opposed to just the exclusive non-drinking community.
I would be one of those. I always keep a good in the fridge, a good mix of non-alcoholic beverages, because sometimes you just don't want to actually have that full on hangover
Totally.
the next day.
Totally.
And you mentioned too, some of it's that perception, and it's not like it's a bad thing to say you want a non-alcoholic drink. Like you said, sometimes maybe they're the designated driver, maybe they just don't want to have anything, but they still want a cocktail. They don't want to have a water or something like that. How important is it to change those perceptions, whether it's the customer, or even those bartenders and restaurants that may have never thought about that before?
I think that it's so incredibly important. And I want to say that a bit of the onus, and this comes from, I think, just the experience I've had this year, but I think it really is on the hospitality community. Because what we've seen is that there is a tremendous difference in the sales, and you just like the volume of non-alcoholic beverages that people will order from an establishment that makes it easy and innocuous. Even the places that like just integrate it into their regular menu and maybe have an asterisk besides the cocktails that they can order non-alcoholic, as opposed to having to direct someone to a mocktail menu, which feels like some sort of kind of like more juvenile choice. We work with Galaxy here in Louisville, and they sell a ton of naked margaritas, and a lot of times they'll have customers come in and they'll order one or two regular margaritas, and then they'll switch to a naked margarita. And so I think that, as there are so many new products and brands emerging that are eager and excited to get into these spaces, it really ends up being the distributors and the bars and restaurants that become the gatekeepers. And so I think, a big thing for us is trying to really work with them on, education, letting them know what we've seen, what's worked, because if you have a bottle, hidden on the back bar somewhere where the customer can't see of a non-alc product and it's not on the menu, you're probably not going to sell much, because people aren't going to go out of their way to ask, hey, by the way, can you potentially whip me up something non-alcoholic? But if they see it right there in plain print before them, it makes it a lot easier thing for somebody to opt into. So I think our customers are getting much more courageous, because they're the ones that are driving a lot of the demand in these places. It's just about, getting these bars and restaurants on board and getting these bartenders on board. And I think a lot of it is kind of like dismantling that idea that non-alc is a threat, that non-alc is going to take something away from them, and, that it means that alcohol won't be as relevant and important. And I think it's quite the contrary. I think, we're just creating a healthier environment, and I think there's room for everyone at the table.
It's another option for someone to have a drink that might not have gone that way. And I'm curious too. You mentioned one, getting the process down, two, getting into these bars, restaurants, things like that. What have been some of those challenges that you faced that you maybe didn't expect along the way, or maybe you did?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is, a little bit due to my own naivety and I guess ignorance, not having worked in the beverage industry before. But, I think when I first set out and was kind of developing my business plan, it was really exciting to see that as a non-alc product, we could just distribute and move product in any which way we wanted. We didn't have to work with a distributor. We didn't have to work within the 3-tier system. We could sell directly to bars and restaurants, just like no, legal restrictions around anything. But I think the thing that we've realized is that that might be true. And, the profitability might look really exciting there. But, there's two parts of it. Like, one, these establishments don't want to go through the hassle of creating like one-off invoices or having conversations with folks separate than their regular sales reps. It's just, these places are such busy, bustling places as is. Like, they want you to be able to integrate into the kind of structure, infrastructure that they're used to operating in. And I think the other thing that we realized was that, unless we're working with distributors, we don't really credentialize ourselves in the same way. There's really this kind of like stamp and seal of approval that you get from kind of working within the traditional spirits and alcohol infrastructure. And so I think, out of the gate, we were, going to be disruptive across the board and do everything different, which, it was fun to try, and I think fun to see what really did work and didn't. But I think we're in this new position where we're like, okay, well, we already have a disruptive product. The product itself is a little bit of a tricky sell. It requires a lot of education and hand holding. So like, maybe there are other parts of the process where we don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel, and we can kind of work within the existing systems and structures. And I think that's been where we've been finding our sweet spot. And, as we look towards this next year, we'll be getting into distribution in multiple markets. And I think, the team, we all feel really good and excited about that. So
that is interesting. That is, because you would think, because I know for some, like Athletic, that's been a huge boon for them, because they can ship, they can do all sorts of things, which I'm sure that if you're going direct to consumer is great, but the direct to bars and others is a little more difficult.
Exactly. And I think that, we have and will continue to see our direct to consumer channel grow. But the other piece of that is, that's just not how folks are used to buying spirits. And so, it's like most folks aren't going online to buy, that bottle of Bullet. And it's just kind of a different type of behavior. And so, for us to be able to expect certain volumes there, it's like we also have to educate consumers that that's an option. And so I think we've realized that, being in distribution as we continue to grow direct to consumer, I think is an important kind of channel mix.
And then I guess my last question for you is, what's next for y'all? I mean, obviously 2022 is kind of closing down. You're a couple years into this thing. What does the next year look like for y'all?
So I think we are finally getting our stride, and a lot of it has to do with, I think, us spending a tremendous amount of time with industry partners this year, bars, restaurants, and conversations with distributors to be like, okay, like, this was kind of our dream sky's the limit scenario, but like, what's really feasible? And so I think that, through that process, I think we have built a lot of really great relationships with bars and restaurants that have been able to generate enough demand that we've been able to start getting some distributors on board. And so while I can't announce who they are yet, I think we're really excited to be expanding beyond Louisville to be in Southern California, in Nashville, and Florida, and some select kind of places in New York City this coming year. So, we really used Louisville as our test grounds, test market, and this year will be with a much more kind of national focus. So fingers crossed, there's going to be a lot to learn through this as well.
Well, the good news is, it's not like the normal alcohol space where every single state is a completely different, behemoth to get through of red tape. So that should help a little bit, but it's still an exciting time. And like I said, it's a cool product to see, and it's really cool to see what you're doing, because this is a growing space, and one that a lot of folks are very interested, whether it's this time of year, the holiday time, maybe post holiday for a dry January, but now more so than ever, just year round, as they make it part of their life.
Absolutely.
And, Becca, I appreciate you sharing the story of Naked Lady, and I can't wait to see what's next.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you having me. This was great. So thank you so much.
Find more from Hops and Spirits at hopspirits.com.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.